Lisa woke up earlier than usual, her mind too stirred to stay in bed. She quietly crawled out from under the covers, careful not to wake David, her husband, and stole out of the room. The sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon, illuminating their small house on the outskirts of a small town in a southern state. In the kitchen, she made coffee and sat down at the table, watching the faint light fill the space around her. Her life, at first glance, was perfect. A nice house, a stable marriage, a quiet town. Everyone knew them as the perfect couple, supporting each other in everything. But only Lisa knew how empty that life was. Her marriage to David, the man she once loved so much, now seemed like a burden. He was a good man, but their relationship had turned into a routine that drained her. David worked as a mechanic at a local car service station, where he was appreciated for his hard work and responsibility. In his free time, he did housework, tended to his garden, and loved fishing. Lisa also worked. She helped out at the city library, where she spent most of her day surrounded by books and peace, which eased her state of mind a bit. But it was only a brief respite from the thoughts that were always bothering her. Her relationship with David seemed to be frozen. They used to talk about the future and dream together, but now everything had come to nothing. She began to feel lonely even when they were together. David seemed satisfied with his life, didn't notice her inner feelings, and this only deepened her sense of isolation. Lisa took a sip of coffee, trying to push these thoughts away. She was looking out the window when she heard the sound of a car pulling up to their house. Thomas, David's brother. He lived nearby and often came to help his brother with repairs because he worked as a construction worker. There was always a certain tension emanating from his visits that Lisa couldn't quite explain. Thomas was a completely different personality than David. He was more confident, outgoing, and loved to tell stories about his adventures. Lisa sometimes caught herself being more interested in what Thomas had to say than what was going on in her own life. It was dangerous, but exciting at the same time. "Hello, Lisa." Thomas smiled as he entered the kitchen. His appearance was as unexpected as ever, but he acted as if he were a part of the house. "Hi, Thomas," she replied, trying to look calm, although something was stirring inside her. "Is David still asleep?" he asked, giving her a quick glance that seemed longer than necessary. "He worked late last night," she answered, avoiding direct contact with his eyes. Thomas was only a few years older than David, but there was a big difference between them. He had broader shoulders, a more confident posture, and always seemed to be in complete control of the situation. When he was around, Lisa always felt some kind of unexplainable tension. She knew it was wrong to be so interested in her husband's brother, but she couldn't help her feelings. "You didn't sleep well either?" Thomas asked, taking a quick look at her face. "No, it was just my thoughts that kept me awake," she replied, pretending to be focused on her coffee. "Too many thoughts are dangerous," he said, half joking, but his voice was laced with seriousness. Lisa smiled, but inside she was worried. Thomas always said something that seemed innocuous at first glance, but left a lasting mark on her mind. He knew how to read her, to notice what she was carefully hiding from others. "I'm going to help David with the garage," he said as he left the kitchen, and Lisa felt the tension in the air ease a little after he left. She stayed in the kitchen for a few more minutes, trying to collect herself, her mind wandering back to how her feelings for David had changed since Thomas had become more present in their lives. It was hard for her to admit, but she was thinking more about Thomas than her own husband, and this could have dangerous consequences. Meanwhile, David woke up, his body still feeling tired after a long day at work. He stood up slowly, feeling a slight pain in his back, and walked to the kitchen, where Lisa was finishing her coffee. "Good morning," he said, smiling softly. "Hi," Lisa replied, but her voice was a little distant. David was used to moments like this in their marriage. He knew that Lisa was withdrawn and often lost in thought. It didn't bother him that much. He accepted it as part of her nature. But lately, he began to notice changes in her behavior. She became more distant, less likely to talk to him about her feelings. "Is Thomas here?" David asked, looking around. "Yes, he's helping out in the garage," she replied. "It's good that he's here," David said, as if by the way, although his inner feeling was different. He felt some kind of invisible wall between him and Lisa, and this wall seemed to him to be getting more and more impregnable. Thomas was more than just a brother to him. They grew up together, supported each other in all the trials of life. David had never doubted Thomas, but lately something had made him wary of his brother's frequent visits. He couldn't explain this feeling, but it was growing with each passing day. Well, so far it was just a thought. But in this quiet town, it seemed that nothing could remain hidden for long. Thus, in the first chapter, we see the beginning of the characters' development, their internal conflicts and sense of tension. Lisa is on the verge of making important life decisions that could lead to tragedy, and David does not yet realize how close they are to danger. The days in the small town pass slowly, each one similar to the last. Breakfasts, work, dinners, life for most of its inhabitants resembles an endless loop. But not for Lisa. For her, every new day brought mixed feelings of excitement and anxiety. She couldn't stop thinking about Thomas, his frequent visits to their home, his attention that intensified every time they were alone, changed the usual rhythm of her daily routine. Their casual glances, short conversations in the kitchen or in the yard, which began innocently, took on a new meaning. It was hard to say when exactly Lisa realized that her sympathy for Thomas had crossed the line. It happened gradually, like a cloud growing on the horizon until it turned into a storm. She knew it was wrong, but with each passing day, her desire to be with Thomas grew. Thomas, for his part, was not indifferent to Lisa. He saw her gradually changing, becoming more distant from David, and paying attention to him more often. He was subconsciously attracted to her, although he tried to control himself. Thomas knew that it was risky to play with Lisa's feelings, but something about her attracted him more and more. Her vulnerability, the sadness in her eyes, and her dissatisfaction with her own life made her the perfect target for his affection. One evening when David went fishing with his friends, Lisa was alone at home. She tried not to think about Thomas, but her thoughts kept coming back to him. She was standing by the window, looking out at the yard, when she suddenly heard a knock at the door. Her heart leapt as she realized who it could be. Opening the door, she saw Thomas. He stood there with his head slightly tilted to the side, smiling. "Hi, Lisa. Is David home?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. "No, he's out fishing," Lisa replied, trying to remain calm. "Can I come in? I just wanted to discuss something," Thomas said, and without waiting for her to answer, he walked into the house. Lisa realized that she could not refuse him. She stepped aside and watched as Thomas walked into the living room, acting as if he were the owner. He sat down on the couch and gestured for her to join him. "What did you want to discuss?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "Nothing important," Thomas replied, his eyes sparkling with impudence. "I just thought you might be bored alone." Lisa felt tense, but at the same time she felt strangely excited to have Thomas around. "How are you, Lisa?" he asked, leaning a little closer. "Are you happy?" This question took her by surprise. She felt her hands become damp with sweat, and her heart began to beat faster. "Yes, of course," she answered, but even she heard how unconvincing it sounded. Thomas smiled, as if he knew what she would say. "You know," he continued, his voice lowering, "I think about you a lot. I can see that you're not happy. David is a good guy, of course, but you deserve better." Lisa sighed, trying to look away, but she couldn't. His words sounded dangerous, but deep down she knew he was right. She felt an emptiness in her life, and Thomas seemed to be the one who could fill that gap. "Don't say that, Thomas," she whispered, but her voice betrayed her true feelings. "Isn't it true?" he continued. "You deserve something more, and I know you feel it." He took one more step closer to her, and Lisa felt his presence envelop her. Thomas reached out and gently touched her cheek. Lisa closed her eyes, trying to resist the urge, but she was too weak to deny herself the feeling. Her heart was beating faster when she finally opened her eyes and saw Thomas standing so close to her. His hands slid down to her shoulders and Lisa couldn't stop herself. She stepped forward and clung to him, letting her feelings take over. This moment seemed timeless to her. She was no longer thinking about David, about the consequences. Her mind was clouded, and her body obeyed only her emotions. They stood there, holding hands, while the world around them disappeared. Later that evening, when Thomas left, Lisa was left alone with her thoughts. She found it hard to believe what had happened. She sat on the couch, wrapping a blanket around herself as if trying to hide from reality. Her heart was still pounding with excitement, but at the same time she was overwhelmed with guilt. How could she let herself do this? She loved David. Or did she? Thomas, on his way home, felt victorious. He knew he had done something forbidden, but it only fueled his desire. Lisa was his prey, and he was not going to stop there. He could see how she reacted to him, how her eyes sparkled every time he walked into the room. She will be his, and it's only a matter of time. Thomas has always had a special talent for winning people over. He could enchant with his words, his charm, and it was rare for anyone to escape. He was not like David. His brother was always reliable, but simple and predictable. And Thomas loved risk, loved being in the spotlight. When he returned home, he thought about how it would all end. What would he do next? Would he continue to develop this relationship with Lisa, or would he just play with her feelings and then leave her? He hadn't decided yet, but one thing was clear: he would not give up this game. The next few weeks were tense. Lisa tried to act normal with David, but her internal conflict was growing every day. It was hard for her to hide her feelings for Thomas, and seeing him only made it worse. Thomas continued to come to their house, to help David with repairs, or just to come over for tea. But each such meeting became more and more saturated with undisguised tension between him and Lisa. Once, when David went to another city for a few days on business, Lisa and Thomas were left alone in the house. It was inevitable. Their romance was developing rapidly, and they both knew they couldn't stop. That evening, when they met again in the kitchen, there were no more barriers between them. Thomas touched her face again, and this time Lisa did not pull away. Their lips merged in a kiss, and the moment seemed endless. But even at that moment, deep down, Lisa knew that it couldn't last. She felt that this play with fire could lead to dire consequences. Everything seemed to be taking its course as it should. David and Thomas continued their daily routines, and Lisa tried to lead a normal life, hiding the secret drama that was unfolding in her soul. But she felt that every day the situation was getting worse, and sooner or later, everything would explode. Her affair with Thomas, this forbidden relationship, was pulling her deeper into the abyss. Thomas began to visit them more often, even when David was at home. This made Lisa nervous, but Thomas seemed to enjoy the effect his presence was having. He acted as if he had everything under control, even when he and Lisa exchanged covert glances in David's presence. One of these evenings was to be a turning point. Lisa had always known that something would happen sooner or later, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. That evening, David invited Thomas and a few other friends to dinner. It was an ordinary event, a simple barbecue in their garden, where everyone was relaxing after a hard week at work. It was a hot summer day, and the evening was warm and humid. There was a tension in the air, though only those who knew what was going on behind the scenes could notice. Lisa couldn't find a place to sit in the morning. Her nerves were on edge. She helped to set the table, but she constantly felt Thomas's eyes on her, which only aggravated her condition. David, on the other hand, seemed completely calm. As always, he greeted the guests with kindness, grilled meat, and kept the conversation going. He told funny stories that made the guests laugh and seemed like the perfect host for the evening. Lisa felt that she had to maintain this image, so she smiled and nodded, even though her thoughts were elsewhere. As the evening gradually came to a climax and the guests began to leave, Thomas stayed behind to help clean up after dinner. David, tired after a long day, went into the house, leaving them alone in the garden. Lisa could feel the tension between her and Thomas growing. She knew she shouldn't be alone with him, but it was too late. "We need to talk, Lisa," he said quietly, so that he wouldn't be heard from the house. "Thomas, not now," she replied, trying to keep her voice down, but her heart was pounding as if it would leap out of her chest. "You can't hide anymore," he continued, ignoring her protest. "We can't go on like this forever." Lisa felt fear building inside her. She had never thought that Thomas would want to reveal their affair so openly. She was afraid of what might happen if it got to David. Her marriage and her whole life could be destroyed in an instant, but Thomas stood in front of her, waiting for her answer. "I can't," she whispered. "It's too dangerous." "Dangerous?" Thomas smiled as he came even closer. You crossed that line a long time ago. Now you either come with me or… He didn't finish his sentence, but Lisa understood what he meant. She couldn't get out of this situation in one piece. Her infatuation with Thomas, which had once seemed like a harmless adventure, had turned into a trap. She did not know how to proceed. Night had finally fallen on the town. Only a few lanterns in the garden were lit, and a light breeze swayed the branches of the trees playfully. Lisa stood in the yard, not moving, when she suddenly heard a dull sound coming from the house. Her heart clenched in her chest. She looked around and saw the figure of Thomas suddenly stagger and fall to the ground. "Thomas!" she cried out, rushing to him. When she got closer, her eyes opened wide in horror. Thomas was lying on his back. His eyes were open, but there was no life in them. On his chest was a stain of blood that was quickly spreading across his shirt. Lisa was speechless, unable to believe what she was seeing. She stood over Thomas's body, her mind refusing to accept reality. Something shone in the grass next to his body. Lisa leaned down and saw a kitchen knife. Her hands trembled as she touched the handle, but immediately pulled her hand away. She realized it was the murder weapon. Who could have done this? There was absolute silence around, broken only by a light wind that stirred the grass. Not a single sound was heard in the house. Lisa looked around, trying to understand what had happened, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness. Everything looked the same as it always did. But now Thomas was lying dead in front of her. She fell to her knees next to his body, not knowing what to do next. Her hands were trembling, and her thoughts were confused. She did not know whether she was a witness to a brutal murder or an unwitting participant. She remembered what she had said to Thomas a few minutes ago about the danger, but she couldn't believe it had gone this far. Lisa did not know how long she had spent sitting by Thomas's body. She had lost her sense of reality. Her hands were covered in blood, even though she hadn't even touched the knife. Her clothes, her skin, everything was stained with this horror. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. She just sat there as if paralyzed. When she finally managed to get up, her legs felt like cotton wool. Lisa looked around again, trying to see if anyone was around, but she saw nothing. Who had done this? Who was there? The house was dead silent, with only the distant sounds of the city breaking the night scene. She returned to the house, trying not to leave any traces behind her, and when she got inside, she immediately ran to the bathroom. Lisa looked at her reflection in the mirror in horror. Her face was pale and there was still blood on her hands. She put her hands under cold water and felt the water burning her skin. She tried to wash the blood away, but the feeling did not leave her. Her mind was in a state of shock, but she tried to collect herself. Who could have done this? She could not fathom it. The morning after Thomas's murder was gloomy and disturbing. Lisa couldn't gather her thoughts. Her mind seemed to be frozen in the night before. Thomas's body lay in the garden until dawn, when the police arrived and began their investigation. Lisa sat in the corner of the kitchen, trembling with fear and the cold reality that unfolded before her. The detectives arrived a few hours after the body was found. The two detectives who had taken over the murder investigation were Detective John Reeves, an experienced investigator who had been working cases for over 20 years, and his new partner, Detective Sarah Martin, who was young but extremely attentive and quick-witted. They quickly assessed the situation, set up security around the scene, and began to inspect the house. When Lisa saw them, her heart sank. She didn't know what to say, and she wasn't even sure what she should do. All her thoughts were confused, and she could barely stand up. "Miss Lisa," Reeves said in a soft but firm voice, "we understand that this is difficult for you, but we need some answers. We're going to ask you questions, and I want you to answer as honestly as possible." Lisa just nodded, unable to speak. Her hands were still trembling, like when she had touched the knife that lay next to Thomas's body. She knew she shouldn't have done it, but she was so shocked that she couldn't do anything else. Reeves and Martin looked over the scene, scrutinizing everything. The knife, the bloodstains on the ground, the shoe prints. Their eyes lingered on the knife that lay in the grass next to Thomas's body. Sarah Martin, using gloves, carefully picked up the knife. "Fingerprints," she said, examining the handle carefully. Reeves nodded, as if he had already anticipated this. "We'll send this off for analysis," he said. He turned to Lisa, who was still sitting in the kitchen, staring at the floor. "Miss Lisa, can you explain what happened last night? Were you with Thomas when he died?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she could barely keep herself from bursting into tears. She tried to find the words to explain, but it was hard to get started. I don't know what happened," she finally began, her voice weak and choppy. "We were talking, and then I heard a sound, turned around and saw him fall. I went to him and there was a knife. I didn't know what to do and—" "You touched the knife?" Detective Reeves leaned closer, his voice calm but clear. "Yes, but I didn't know what I was doing. I was panicking. I just wanted to help." The detectives looked at each other, their faces neutral, but there was a subtle tension between them. "We understand how you feel, Miss Lisa," Reeves continued, "but we need to know more. Did you have a relationship with Thomas other than that which should be between a wife and her husband's brother?" The question ran through her mind, and she felt her insides go cold. She had not expected this question to come up so quickly. Lisa fell silent, her gaze changing. She could not continue to hide the truth. Sooner or later, it would come out. "We had an affair," she finally admitted, her voice trembling. "I know it was wrong, but—" Sarah Martin leaned closer to her, listening to every word. "Were you in love with him?" she asked quietly. Lisa thought for a moment. She was not sure of her feelings for Thomas. She felt a strong attraction to him, but was it love? She didn't know. "I don't know," she answered after a long silence. "Maybe it was admiration, passion. I can't say for sure." Reeves took a deep breath and took a few steps around the room. "You realize that this now makes you a suspect?" His voice became firmer. "Your fingerprints are on the murder weapon, and you admitted to having an affair with the victim." Lisa felt like she was trapped. She knew her situation looked bad, but she couldn't change what had already happened. "But I didn't kill him," she exclaimed, tears already rolling down her cheeks. "I couldn't have done it." "Then who did?" Reeves asked. "If not you, who would want him dead?" Lisa had no answer. She didn't know who could have done it. She thought of David. Could he have somehow found out about their affair? Did he suspect them? But Lisa felt that David could not have done such a thing. A few hours later, when David returned home, the detectives were waiting for him. He looked tired but calm as he entered the house. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he could sense that something was wrong. Lisa sat on the couch, watching as the detectives began to question him. "Mr. David," Detective Reeves began, "can you tell us where you were last night?" David calmly replied, "I went to my friend James's house. We went fishing. You can ask him. He will confirm." "What time did you get home?" "Around 1 a.m., David answered. "When I got back, Lisa was asleep. I didn't hear anything." The detectives looked at each other. David's alibi seemed solid. If James confirmed his story, David couldn't have been the killer. But there was something that still bothered the detectives. "Did you know about your wife's relationship with your brother?" Sarah Martin asked. David froze for a moment, but his face remained impenetrable. "No," he answered briefly, looking directly at the detective. Lisa sat in silence, watching the interrogation. She couldn't understand how David could remain so calm, knowing what had happened to his brother, and even more so after learning about her affair with Thomas. She felt as if something terrible was about to happen, but David held himself together as if what was happening didn't affect him at all. Detective Reeves, watching David's every move, continued his interrogation. "You didn't suspect anything?" His voice was even, but with a hint of skepticism. "Thomas was often in your home, and the relationship between him and your wife could have been noticeable." David sighed and seemed to finally allow himself some emotion. "Thomas was my brother," he began. "He helped me with the work around the house. We were close, so I never thought anything was wrong. Lisa didn't give me any reason to suspect either. Maybe I was too busy working to notice what was going on under my nose, but that doesn't mean I could do something so horrible." David's words rang true, but Sarah Martin, sitting next to Reeves, noticed the small nuances in his behavior. He was too reserved. His words were right, but his tone seemed a little distant, as if he was trying to avoid discussing personal feelings. Your alibi, Mr. David? Sarah interjected. You say you were fishing with James, but were there any other witnesses? Did anyone else see you besides your friend? David was silent for a moment, seemingly considering his answer. It wasn't a long silence, but it was enough to make the tension in the room more noticeable. No, he finally said. It was just the two of us. James can confirm what I'm saying. There was no one else in the room. Sarah and Reeves looked at each other. David's alibi was based on the testimony of only one person, which left room for doubt. It didn't remove his suspicions, but it didn't make him the obvious culprit either. The more they listened to him, however, the more questions they had. We'll certainly check into that, Reeves said, making notes in his notebook. But while we're waiting for the results of the forensics and your alibi to check out, we have a few more questions. In particular, about your relationship with Thomas lately. Have there been any conflicts between you two? David sighed, and his eyes glistened with emotion. No, we didn't have any conflicts. We were as close as ever. I don't understand who could have done this. Thomas had no enemies. He was a good man. Lisa felt her heart clench. David had spoken of Thomas with such warmth, although inside she knew she had destroyed their bond with her affair. She was overwhelmed with guilt and despair. The detectives decided not to jump to conclusions and to thoroughly check all possible versions. Now that they knew about the affair, their suspicion of Lisa was growing, but there were too many unanswered questions. The fingerprint analysis on the knife confirmed the presence of Lisa's fingerprints, but this was not yet definitive proof of her guilt. She could have just taken the knife, as she had admitted. When the detectives left, Lisa was afraid to talk to her husband. She didn't know how to live with him after he found out about her infidelity. Her fears were confirmed. Although David was in the same house with her and did not speak to her at all, his eyes showed anger and suffering. Thomas's death changed their lives. The next day, Sarah and Reeves met again to discuss the progress of the investigation. Something doesn't add up, Sarah began. Lisa has admitted to the affair, but she doesn't seem to really know who could have killed Thomas. Her fingerprints on the knife are a problem, of course, but her behavior doesn't seem to be that of a killer. Reeves nodded, looking thoughtfully at the crime scene report. And the more we listen to David, the more I'm starting to doubt his story. He seems too calm. But his alibi seems solid at first glance. James confirmed that they were together until late at night. Yes, but what if he was able to leave the fishing for a while? Sarah suggested. The alibi could have been organized. But we have no evidence that David even knew about the affair before the murder. Reeves sighed and looked at the case file. Well, we need proof, so let's focus on what we know. We have the knife with Lisa's fingerprints on it. We have evidence of an affair. Now we need to find witnesses who might have seen or heard something the night of the murder. We can also look at the surveillance footage in the neighborhood if there is any. We also need to find out more about Thomas. Maybe he had some secrets that we don't know about yet. Over the next few days, the detectives thoroughly checked every possible lead. They interviewed neighbors and acquaintances of Thomas and investigated his personal contacts to see if he might have had any other problems or relationships that Lisa and David were unaware of, but they found no obvious enemies or conflicts. Sarah continued to analyze David's behavior. She sensed that he was hiding something, even if it wasn't necessarily related to the murder. The more she listened to him, the more she suspected that David knew more than he was admitting. But his alibi still protected him from direct suspicion. One small detail, which at first did not attract the detective's attention, became a turning point. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood near Lisa and David's home showed a car similar to the one David used, driving by the house on the night of the murder. The exact time coincided with the moment when James claimed that they were still fishing. This detail raised new doubts about David's story. We found a car that looked like his near the house, Sarah said, looking at the camera footage. If he was really there at the time he was supposed to be with his friend, it could mean his alibi is falsified. We can't be sure yet, Reeves replied, but his voice sounded reserved. But it could be important. Now we need to corroborate this testimony. If his alibi is in doubt, that changes everything. The detectives decided to continue the investigation, focusing on details that might seem small at first glance but could help solve the case. The detectives were getting closer to the truth with each step. After they discovered a surveillance video showing David's car outside the house on the night of the murder, Doubts about his alibi grew. This small detail changed the course of the investigation, and now the detectives decided to focus on finding out if David could have been involved in the murder. James, David's friend, tried to stick to the fishing story, but when he was questioned again, he became nervous. Sarah Martin decided to interrogate him separately, applying a little pressure. James finally admitted that he hadn't actually been fishing with David all night. David had left him for a few hours, explaining that it was personal business. This raised a new barrage of questions. When David was called in for another interrogation, he was already facing serious charges. The detectives gathered all the evidence, the camera footage, James's testimony, and some details of his behavior that began to come together. David was sitting in the interrogation room, his eyes focused but tense inside. Detective Reeves, leaning closer to David, opened a report folder and placed a photograph of the car captured by the surveillance camera in front of him. "Is this your car, David?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the suspect. David remained silent, but his hands on the table were nervously clenched into a fist. He took a deep breath, his face calm, but his eyes were shadowed with anxiety. "We found your car outside your house that night," Reeves continued. "Your alibi doesn't hold up. James admitted that you left him for several hours. So where were you, David? Where were you really?" David shook his head and remained silent for a few more minutes. Finally, he looked up at Reeves and Sarah, who was standing next to him. His face was no longer so calm. It showed exhaustion and some kind of internal struggle. "I was there," he finally said quietly. "I came home that night." Reeves did not look away. "What were you doing there?" he asked, waiting for a confession. David took another deep breath. His hands began to shake and he gripped the edge of the table. "I found out about them," he said, his voice low and strained. "I knew about the affair. Maybe not everything, but enough to eat me up inside." He paused as if trying to collect his thoughts, before continuing. "Thomas was my brother, and when I found out he was sleeping with my wife, it broke me. They betrayed me. All these months I thought that everything between them was simple, friendship, help. But it was more than that. I couldn't take it anymore." Sarah came closer and asked quietly, "Did you kill Thomas?" David was silent. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to take the last step. His eyes grew blank as he finally answered, "Yes, I killed him." Reeves and Sarah did not take their eyes off David. For a moment the room was silent. "That night I came home," David continued. "They were in the garden. I stood at a distance and listened to them talk about their future, how they wanted to be together. And then something in me broke. I don't remember everything. I just took the knife that was lying next to me. I don't even remember how it happened. I just saw him falling." His voice became quieter, and he put his head down on the table. He could no longer hold back his emotions. His hands clutched his head and tears rolled down his face. "I didn't want to do this," he whispered, "but I couldn't stop myself." After David's confession, everything became clear. It was a murder motivated by passion and betrayal. He could not accept the fact that his brother and his wife had betrayed him, and this pushed him to rash actions. Detectives realized that this was not a planned crime. It was a momentary outburst of rage that led to his death. David was arrested immediately after his confession. Lisa was stunned to learn the truth. She could not believe that things had gone so far. She felt guilty, but realized that nothing could be fixed now. After several months of trial, David was found guilty of Thomas's murder. He was sentenced to a long prison term. During the trial, he did not try to justify himself, saying only once, "I deserved it." Lisa could no longer stay in the house where so many tragedies had happened. She decided to move away, leaving behind everything that reminded her of the life she once thought she had. Her affair with Thomas had destroyed all her relationships, and his death put an end to all her hopes. She didn't know how to move on with her life and meet new people. Detectives Sarah Martin and John Reeves closed the case with a sense of closure. It was a sad story of betrayal that led to disaster. However, the investigation Careful search for evidence and small, initially unnoticeable details helped to establish the truth. The tragedy was over, but its shadow remained for a long time over the town that had witnessed this drama.